Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri, and all of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. The United States prides itself on its immigrant heritage, but in the last century, in particular, has had a very hard time figuring out what to do about immigration. Debates about how to shape the future of the United States by controlling who can become an American citizen have been freighted with irony. Ever since Thomas Nast drew cartoons with the satirical slogan, quote, "Chinese stay out," signed "the scum of Europe," close quote. Emma Lazarus imagined the Statue of Liberty welcoming the tired, poor, huddled masses, but generations of editors have revised those stirring phrases to offer preference to masses less huddled or refuse less wretched from this teeming shore rather than that one. In her new book, Dreamland, Dr. Carly Goodman provides fresh perspectives on American immigration policy by focusing on the diversity visa lottery. Created in 1990 in response to complaints about certain forms of immigration restriction, the lottery was born, Goodman writes, from, quote, "a perfectly American blend of cynicism and idealism," close quote. Those who hoped to evade systems of points and preferences cooperated with those who wanted to get away from such systems altogether. And they have created a process where about 50,000 or so lucky applicants are drawn at random from a pool of many hundred thousands on odds that range from 1 in 25 to 1 in 75, according to official statistics. The DV lottery has provided opportunities for people across the global South, most notably perhaps in Africa, to come to the United States, where advertisements for the program dot the urban landscape, as revealed by photos also included in Dreamland. In tracing the history of the DV lottery, Goodman tackles a great many subjects in our recent history, from the politics of immigration to the invention of internet spam. It's a story well worth studying and well worth discussing today. So what is the diversity visa lottery? What role has it played in American immigration policy? And where should it fit in the future? What does the story of this lottery have to tell us about the ironies, paradoxes, and taboos of immigration policymaking? These questions, and yours, will guide us today in our conversation with Carly Goodman. Dr. Carly Goodman, who holds degrees from Columbia and Temple University, is, in addition to being the author of Dreamland, the senior editor of Made by History at the Washington Post, and an immigrant content specialist for public history projects. We are delighted to have you with us today. Welcome to People, Politics, and Prose, Carly Goodman.
It's delightful to be here. I want to thank you and FPRI for hosting me, and I really want to thank you for the chance to have this reunion. We're old friends from my days at Temple, and it's just always a delight to have a conversation with you, Ron.
Thank you, Carly. Well, and it's been funny. I was realizing, I suppose, like, full disclosure, right? Carly was a student in my graduate seminar on European history, European international history. I believe that would have been in the fall of 2010. So kids, ask your parents, right? Back in the day. Anyway, Carly, I got to ask. So this book comes out of your Temple dissertation, but what is it that led you to want to write a dissertation, not just about American immigration policy, but about the DV lottery?
Yes. Well, it was born in graduate school, so I wrote it to get my PhD, as one must. But I have a couple of reasons for really wanting to write the book. I'm fascinated by this policy history, the way that the history of immigration is a history of belonging. Mm-hmm. And negotiations about belonging, how those terms of belonging have also been shaped by histories of exclusion, and how in this field we really live with ghosts of the past. I was planning to write about refugee policy, asylum seekers, something perhaps even more germane to the breaking news headlines of today, back in 2010 when we encountered each other. But that first summer after your seminar, I was like, Ron Granieri, you've driven me crazy. I have to go as far away from here as I can. And my partner and I decided to spend the summer traveling around West Africa. We had about 12 weeks to travel. We were visiting a relative in Ghana. And it was there that when we were going into internet cafes, checking our email, emailing our parents, assuring them that we were just fine because we were a little younger then. Um,
We were all a little younger then, Carly. That's right.
We would sit at these cyber cafes and see people going to the Department of State website and looking up stuff about this lottery. And even though my spouse and I were both pretty familiar with the general landscape of US immigration policy, we hadn't really heard about this diversity visa lottery. And that initial observation was, this thing is huge here. It really looms large in people's imagination, but it's all but invisible back in the United States. So I really wanted to understand it. Where did this come from? How did this get here? How does this shape people's experiences of the United States? And also, like, isn't that interesting, right? That there's so many things about the immigration policy system that are invisible to most Americans.
Right.
Bureaucracies that are sort of on our behalf, you know, and the way that they treat immigrants and prospective immigrants, often rendered invisible.
Sure. You know, it's funny. I went to the website for the diversity visa lottery this past week as I was preparing for this program, just to get a sense of what it's like. And yeah, the idea that this is an outward facing part of the US government that we don't think about. And I mean, I'm gonna dive right into what was a hard question, right? When we talk about immigration policy, right? You know, there's a truism going back to childhood, right? That it only makes sense to have a club if you can keep somebody out, right? If everybody can be a member, then what's the fun of having the club? And so the problem for citizenship and the problem for immigration is, how does one develop programs that are in some way fair and practical without keeping people out just for the sake of keeping people out? And what do you think is the biggest misconception that Americans may have about immigration policy writ large?
I don't, yeah, just to nod to one of your comments there, I don't think, you know, my being a Pennsylvanian is diminished when my neighbor has a baby and creates a new Pennsylvanian, or my friends from Maryland. You know, we're trying to get New Yorkers to come down here, right? So,
excellent points. Thank you.
So
this
there's all
good.
kinds of entities that don't lose their meaning even when they're non-exclusive, right? But the other point you're raising is that, like, it's just entirely misconceptions stacked upon each other. I think one of them is one thing that you nodded to also, is that this idea that it even has been or aspires to be fair or practical. When we know that the history of migration policy is really interwoven with really explicit projects of both inclusion and exclusion that have shaped the demographics of the nation. But I do think that this idea that it has been fair or was fair or at its best might be fair is really embedded in people's mental models of how the system has worked. And there's some survivor bias there. So people sort of think, well, I'm here, and so when my family came in the past, you know, whatever system filtered them in and other people out must have had some kind of reason, you know, some kind of fairness to it. And so I think that allows that that notion to sort of like continue to exist even in the face of all kinds of evidence that, you know, there's a lot of harm to the systems that we have in place, right? There's a lot of violence happening. A lot of people, I don't think, would be endorsing, you know, child separation or violence at the border, or the extent of caging that we do, or even deportations. And yet, if your core assumption is that basically this is fair with some asterisks, then it's easy to sort of write those things off as exceptions rather than the essence of the system.
Right. Well, and you point out in several places in the book, right, as people will often say when they make that contrast between the past and the present, as they'll say, well, why can't people just come? Why can't people just come the right way, which is the way that my ancestors came? People will say, without really knowing what exactly the right way looked like in 1875 or 1890 or 1920. And do you think? Well, I mean, you say misconceptions upon misconceptions, but
Yeah.
what would the quote right way, when people say that the right way, what do you think they mean, and what would that look like today? Somebody coming the right way.
Um, I mean, in some funny ways, it resembles the visa lottery.
Yeah, all right,
It
good.
resembles somebody putting their name on a list, waiting to be selected, called into the consular office, screened, being handed a visa, and go ahead,
Right.
go on in. But that's actually a very exceptional part of our immigration policy. Since 1965, the United States has prioritized the entry of the family members of US citizens. Workers in certain kinds of fields, whether temporary or permanent, whether low wage or high wage, people who are here seeking some kind of humanitarian relief, whether that's refugee status, asylum, or another form of like temporary legal status due to humanitarian concerns. And so those are three sort of buckets
Mhm.
of sort of how the United States selects its immigrants, and they're not comprehensive. And if a person in the world who dreams of becoming an American someday doesn't have that U.S. citizen spouse to sponsor them and to bring them here, they're really out of luck. So there's no list that you can put your name on, with the exception of this visa lottery program, which is only for nationals of countries that have sent relatively few immigrants to the U.S.
So is that right? So if I am living abroad, and I send in my application, it's not open to all the countries of the world, let's say.
It's not open to all the countries of the world. It's open to most of the countries of the world because the top 10 sending countries has tended to be a pretty static list. So nationals of Mexico and China, Jamaica, the Philippines, India are not eligible for the diversity visa lottery because, as it's sort of conceptualized by these policymakers, their entry into the United States would not diversify the national origins of US immigrants. Whereas countries with histories of sending very few immigrants, countries like Cameroon, Ghana, Kenya, these countries are eligible. So
Mhm.
people within them can play the lottery and win. And I mentioned African countries because those have become sort of a very important group of beneficiaries of the visa lottery, but the lottery was also designed to enable European migration. As I mentioned, that list of the top countries, Mexico, China, India, the Philippines, the Dominican Republic, countries that have sent many immigrants in recent years, you'll note there are not a lot of European countries on that list. So
Mhm.
European countries once dominated immigration, and I think continue to kind of illustrate what people mean when they say immigration. The archetypical immigrant is a 19th century European with some great bootstraps to pull up.
16 cents in his pocket, and yes, and
Yeah.
all his worldly possessions. Yeah.
Right. And also, familial and kin networks and access to the US that Chinese immigrants didn't have, and all kinds of, systemic and structural keys that make that person not just an individual enacting his dreams all on his own. But since the middle of the 20th century, Europe has not been the key sender of immigrants to the United States, both for reasons related to shifts in US policy, but also because of geopolitical shifts.
Right. Well, and that, of course, is one of the great ironies of the story that you tell that I think we need to start with. And that is, it's one of those things you want to lean after you show these pictures, and people associate perhaps these days the diversity visa lottery with West Africa. That's when you sort of lean in and you say, what if I told you that the diversity lottery started out because the Irish wanted to immigrate to the United States? And so how do we, if I say
Yeah.
that to people after they get over their shock, How
It
did that
sounds like a
happen?
great selling point for a book where you would learn something new on every page and never cease to be surprised
How
in
about
what
that?
direction I was taking you. Um, they don't teach us how to market ourselves in history PhD school, but I have to try. So to tell that story, I don't know, where do I start? I start in the 1980s in the book, but I'm going to start in the 1920s right
All
now
right. All
and
right.
tell you that the history of federal immigration control is a history of restriction and exclusion. 1880s, Chinese exclusion, the first federal exclusion based on race. 1920s, a bunch of eugenicists get it into their head that we need to control the demographics and the stock of the United States by curtailing immigration from places that are seen as, genetically inferior, likely to degrade the American stock and make it less Anglo-Saxon. I think you and I are both, from this degraded, undesirable stock.
I'm afraid so. That's right. Both of us, right? That obviously the system didn't work well enough, Carly. It didn't keep us out,
Well,
right?
no, we got in under the wire, right? Our
Right.
families came over in this era of mass immigration between the 1880s and the 1920s, mass immigration from Europe. But these eugenicists really get in there and they set national origins quotas based on, so they are allocating visas based on the racial and ethnic desirability of the countries of origin of immigrants. So they create this whole architecture of race and ethnicity, saying like, we really want more of these British and Irish and German immigrants and like fewer of you Jewish, Italian, Southern and Eastern European immigrants. And those quotas they don't perfectly seal the border, but they dramatically reshape how immigration works from the 20s until the 1960s, at which point good congressional liberals are like, this is pretty embarrassing that we still have these eugenic national origins quotas on the books, explicitly adopted to end the melting pot. This is not going to fly in a 1960s global world, especially one where the United States is hoping to win a Cold War, win hearts and minds of a world that is also rapidly decolonizing. So we have to do something to stop embarrassing ourselves. What we're going to do is end these quotas, adopt a system based on family unification as like the core ideal, as well as some other categories. Hope that immigration patterns continue as they have been, and call it a day. Formal equality looks great. We're no longer racially exclusive on paper, but if you don't have a US citizen relative to sponsor you, like you can't really come until US empire and war start creating new circuits of migration in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to today. So that is the story of how we get the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which continues to kind of form the basis of our immigration system. And, everyone's happily ever after. No, the problem is in the 1980s, Irish immigrants are facing an economic decline that is very disappointing because they were hoping that Ireland's economy in the post-war period was developing. Kids were going to school and university. They were being invested in as this next generation of Irish leaders, and the economy crashes. And what do? They do what millions of Irish people have done before, which is look abroad. They look to the sea. So that's when they encounter this stubborn fact that they no longer have the family ties to sustain legal immigration to the United States. And that really feels unfair because who built the country in the 19th century? How many Irish surnames are there in the United States? We've had a couple of Irish presidents, right? We have one now. And that doesn't sit right. There's this long history of Irish immigration that's been mutually beneficial for the Irish diaspora itself and also for the making of the American nation. And they look at that 1965 Act and the curtailment of their previous level of privilege, and they identify that as the problem. We used to have access, now we don't have access. And they go to, and so advocates for these undocumented Irish immigrants Oh, did I mention they become undocumented?
Because they're able to get tourist or student visas, and so they get into the country and they just stay.
Yes, yes. As many unauthorized immigrants do, they get temporary visas to the US and then they stay because there's no prospects for them back home. And I take that really seriously because there is a story in here of like immense white privilege that these actors are able to engender a certain amount of empathy from white policymakers who have really sunny memories and sort of myths around the family immigration that sustained them and made their lives. But these Irish immigrants who come to the US and remain without authorization just want a chance to live, right? And they're unable to enact their dreams and build lives back in Ireland, and they really had hoped to be able to. And then in the United States, they find themselves treated not like, well, maybe in some ways like some of their forebears, but they find a sense of like unwelcome and mounting enforcement of immigration restrictions. And they find that they belong to this category of unauthorized immigrants that is treated very badly in the United States, right? They can't get good jobs. They're looking over their shoulders. They're wondering like, when is the shoe going to drop? And so even though they don't face, explicit racial discrimination, they do live under this shadow of this unauthorized status that they feel is not a result of anything that they have done, but of these shifts in policy, which of course I think it is.
Well, and I say, yeah, that's the irony, or the reason why this strikes them as unfair is because they say, when people say illegal aliens in the 1980s, they're not thinking about some Irish guy who's working behind a bar in New York City, or who's painting houses or doing whatever it is the Irish immigrants are doing. Just like when people say they don't want economic migrants, as though it's that easy to distinguish between somebody who is just moving because they can't get a good job back home and moving because they have some larger existential reason. And so the irony, as you put it, is the Irish end up using the word diversity. The reason the D in the diversity lottery is essentially because they want to find a way to include people in the stream of immigrants who are not already represented by family unification. And so you talk a little bit, you have a whole chapter on the use of the word diversity, which is it's fascinating, right? The different ways it gets put to use.
I always thought it was kind of a weak substitute for something, for like a concept that could be like truly radical. Like it kind of stands in at times for like anti-racism, but we know from the history of diversity how affirmative action was sort of struck down, but diversity becomes this sort of watchword so that you can have some race consciousness in like admissions to a university. But it's reframed not as a form of redress for past wrongs or for systemic and structural discrimination. The way that wealth is, built generationally by some and denied it to others, like instead of talking about that, we talk about diversity, which is seen as benefiting all of the members, right? And so it's almost like we need diversity because white students will benefit from being in more diverse spaces, and this will help our corporations appeal to more customers and things like this, and so it sort of stands in here for this national origin diversity, which is how the Irish sort of arrive at this concept, because they can't just say we need more immigrant visas for white people. That sort of like doesn't fly in post-civil rights America. But they can say, we have these like only these narrow channels of access for legal immigration. Why don't we widen them so that people outside of those existing chains, those existing networks, can have access to and live out this idea of the independent immigrant coming to the United States to make it on her own. And I say all that knowing now that diversity, which I always thought was not a load-bearing concept, has apparently caused a lot of people to lose their minds.
Well, and part of it is because now the fact that the lottery ends up actually bringing people from Africa, now people see diversity and they're like, aha, right? This is exactly, they're thinking this is a particular kind of diversity, which they see as a challenge to whatever image of community that they have.
That's right.
And that's what I think is language is a funny thing, right? As diversity is put in there, and in fact, by these Irish advocates and advocates for the Irish, who kind of know at the time that it's their, well, I mean, this is the complexity of even something like Brown versus Board of Education, right? Is that the argument that integrating schools is good for white children too is it makes sense. Well, it's correct, but it makes sense as an argument to make to try to win over the majority population that might not want to integrate. But if you're only thinking about how it makes the majority population feel, you have to ask yourself, are you really doing anything in particular for the minority population, right? Or they're expected to be there to make everybody else feel good about themselves, that, well, we're not keeping everybody out.
Yeah.
But that's a little that'll be a subject for your next book and for a longer conversation. I want to bring in the policy discussion, especially since here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, right? One of the things that you do in this book that I think readers might be surprised to discover, but I think they also, if they're sufficiently broad-minded, they will also be very delighted to discover, is you have a great deal of interesting political and policy history about West Africa and about U.S. West African relations. So sort of that moves sort of in parallel with the increasing West African participation in the lottery. And so I want to ask you, so you were trained as a U.S. historian at Temple, more or less, and how did you what made you decide to really dig into the African history in addition to this American policy story?
I know I've just always done odd things. Well, my training at Temple was also in international history, and a field that is sometimes thought of as U.S. in the world, or diplomatic history, or U.S. foreign relations history. And so I had in my mind that it was that was really how I was coming into writing about immigration policy. And seeing immigration policy as an expression of international history and U.S. foreign policy that is sometimes relegated to like its own category of thing, but I know that they're deeply enmeshed, particularly since World War II, right? The circuits of U.S. empire and war have become circuits of migration, that these are deeply enmeshed. But I also thought, even when I'm writing a kind of biography of a US policy here, this diversity visa lottery, that you have to really try to get at it from lots of different angles. And I know that when the United States does something like launch a diversity visa lottery, it goes out into the world, but it's not just this unidirectional thing, right, imposed by the United States, that how people encounter it and how people perceive it is deeply shaped by the local conditions of their lives and their history, right? And so I thought it was really important to situate the introduction of the lottery in this very interesting moment of post-colonial history in various African countries. So thinking about this, the way that decolonization sort of moved through these countries of West Africa, the way that they establish independent nation states, and then the struggles that they have in a world that is still very unequal, and they are states that are built, for the extraction of goods, right, for the empires. And that doesn't just like go away overnight, and it certainly doesn't go away when the French are like ripping the phones out of the offices of Conakry and Guinea, things like that. So the lottery comes around in this moment where the economies of some of these countries are being rearranged and reshaped by loan conditionality, structural adjustment programs, international agencies saying to these countries, you've tried this sort of state-led growth thing in these years between the 1960s, 1970s, and it hasn't worked. So what we want you to do is reorient your economies more around free trade, more around exports, more around, like changing, economic policies within your government, listening to our advisors, things like this that then cause these countries to become indebted. And even as they are, even when they are sometimes making economic gains as measured by agencies like the IMF, people are perceiving those shifts in their own ways. So they're perceiving these shifts as diminishing their citizenship. So the end of a lot of state-controlled industries destroys a lot of jobs for people, particularly in urban centers. They're perceiving their own quality of life as diminishing. And emigration takes on a special salience in that kind of context. Right. It's not true that in any given year of the last 100 years, people in Accra would dream of migrating to the United States. That's a very contingent kind of idea that really depends upon understanding these histories. And so that demand for emigration to the United States is born of these sort of local conditions, people's own relationships to their states being disappointing, being renegotiated. And so emigration takes on this increased meaning. And it also occurs at a time, and I know this is like a very long sentence, but it occurs at a time where African migration to Europe is being criminalized. And so we have the creation of like Fortress Europe, the way that the outer boundaries of Europe are hardening as internal boundaries are starting to loosen and become wispier. We'll see what the long-term consequences of all that looks like. But certainly a constant becomes criminalization of African migration, which we see, of course, today in the tragic, bloody, deadly exercise of border control in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. So the United States at this, in the swirl of all this says, oh, do you want to come be an American? Like, just put in your name, apply for a lottery. It's an easy thing to do, to play the lottery. The requirements, there are some requirements. It's not open to everyone, but if you're a high school graduate, why not give it a go? Right. And so isn't that like really an incredible thing to arrive in that kind of context?
Well, and so and it's not as though it's like whenever I think of lotteries, I'm always reminded that there is an offhand reference in 1984 to the fact that there is a national lottery, but that nobody ever really sees who wins. And so Orwell clearly had a skeptical view of lotteries, that they're all just a big scam and nobody actually wins. But this is a lottery that people actually win, right? Tens of thousands of people, I guess, over the life of the diversity lottery, we could say hundreds of thousands of people have become green card holders thanks to following the rules and playing the lottery. And that's not nothing. But it is fascinating how the lottery has also been a target of criticism by immigration restrictionists, right? Because the very fact that people can come from anywhere, who can fill out these things, is, that's exactly what scares people. And so how has the lottery managed to survive up to
now? The lottery has mostly survived up until now. Well, I also say, just like headline here, like we see on the newspapers, if we still get newspapers, every day, there's like
kids ask your parents about that too.
Immigration is always sort of shown to be this like crisis. There's humanitarian crises, there's refugee crises, there's border crisis, there's just this mess, this broken system, right? But here is a part of the immigration policy that's just quietly worked. And we don't get newspaper stories about that because it's not news when something works, right? And so this thing has just like quietly been humming along, like pretty much working for people, bringing immigrants in. Immigrants are just like, regular people. Some of them are great. Some of them I wouldn't want to have coffee with. Like, it's fine. Just people coming here. It's normal. It's the human way of the world, right? And it's been facilitated through this lottery. And so I just want to like tout that as like a counter to some of the like the way that we as a society frame this debate and engage in this debate, as a reminder too that we don't need to be adopting the terms of restrictionists all the time when we have this conversation. Maybe it's a reminder just to Mr. Biden. Maybe you could put in a word for me.
I'll see. Yeah, I'll get on the phone. He lives just down the road from me here in out in Westchester. No, but there's a couple questions, and one also I see that we've got some questions in the Q&A function here on the Zoom page, and so please, if you do have questions, please throw them in as well. We're always happy to see them. So one is Trudy Thompson just wants to note that she knows a couple from Uganda who came on a diversity visa 20 years ago and started a school. And that she now supports, which is so this connection between Uganda and the U.S. thanks to the diversity visa. But Fritz Heinzen asks a policy question, or sort of two-part policy question, right? One is, does anybody else, as far as you know, run a diversity lottery, or is this is this like so many other things in immigration policy? Just it's a unique thing that we do over in this country. Yeah, and what kind, because I'm thinking that when people talk about other examples of immigration policy, they'll point to Australia, or they'll talk about, why can't we have a point system? I'd be curious to know what you think about that. But also, like, has anybody else tried this kind of lottery, or does it say something about the particular appeal of people being willing to buy a ticket for a green card in the United States, that this is an only in America kind of thing?
Well, I can't speak to the question of only in America because I haven't done a comprehensive thing. Fair. And it's not the only place where a lottery type system exists, even in U.S. immigration. I don't know if you've heard about the H-1B lottery, where that's really distinct. A lottery for employers to get the visa spaces for temporary high wage workers to come and work in their industries. So if the question is, does anyone else, I don't know, because I think there might also be some diversity allocation in some of the point systems. So I'm not really sure about that. But that's a good point, actually, when they were debating the diversity visa lottery, they thought about a point system. And actually, the Irish were quite keen on a system that would give you extra points for English language skills. Of course, many Nigerians, Ghanaians, and Cameroonians could also benefit from such a thing. But it was eventually just dismissed as being too onerous to administer.
And also because you have to make sure that people are being honest with you. The more questions you ask, the more you have to police those answers, right? Yes,
and actually, it's an invitation to fraud, to be when you're singier. Actually, in a lot of ways, because it encourages the production of degrees and documentation and all kinds of things. So it's this arms race of bureaucratic complexity that people, it's a dance, I guess. And so that's why they rejected the point system out of hand. And I don't to my mind, also, those systems are very classist. Which is maybe goes against some of our purported American values, that this assumption that the only people who can contribute are those with fancy degrees and sterling, pedigrees and things like that. There's something more egalitarian about a visa lottery that ultimately actually does wind up bringing people with relatively high levels of education, but that keeps the door and the idea open. And I also just think the United States is not necessarily, no country is very good at predicting what will benefit it.
Right. All those people with 16 cents in their pockets, right? If we're going to tell them now that that's not worth anything, we're missing out on an Andrew Carnegie, right?
Well, that's fine. And we can also miss out on all kinds of like tech innovators and utopianists, because ultimately I'm not sure about them either. But also there is this idea that in the United States, people, it's immigrants who carry and are keepers of the American dream, if it exists at all, right? And so it's not something that we give them, it's something that they bring with them. And sometimes American like discrimination and the way that we make it difficult for immigrants to work or attain legal status, all of these things, which I think we should stop doing that. We should be more welcoming. We should make life easier for people, just let people live. But those things have led to like high concentrations of immigrants in entrepreneurship. We have a lot of immigrant-run businesses, immigrant-run foodways. And there's something, very dynamic about this, and something that I think we would struggle to predict. And I don't necessarily trust our STEM overlords for deciding like what has value in our society, because it's not just those with STEM degrees. PhDs in history are also good, and also non-PhDs are great.
PhDs are okay too. That's right.
Just just some insider stuff for us, but also there's so many ways that we contribute to life in our communities, whether that's raising children, caring for children, domestic work that doesn't even get counted as economic activity, and just the way that we can support and care for each other in community. There's not everything can be reduced to widgets.
This is true. Well, and as it happens, right, we have a comment here from Rishan Desta, who says, thank you for hosting this important topic. Thanks to the diversity lottery, I came to the United States right after graduating high school in Ethiopia. I was able to support myself and my family throughout college and medical school. I am now an emergency medicine physician serving rural Tennessee. So right there, right, just as you were speaking, Carly, right, here we have an honest to goodness testimonial, right? This is what the diversity lottery can do.
And the United States should be exceedingly grateful that people would choose to enact their dreams here.
Right.
I know many people have gratitude for the United States for having the visa lottery, but it's a two-way street.
Right. Well, and speaking of that street, let's talk about the information superhighway, because one of the other aspects of the story, like that, how's that for a transition, right? But one of the other aspects of the story that's very interesting and makes this book definitely worth reading, so you do indeed find a delight on every page, as you said, is the growth of the visa lottery is connected to the growth of the internet and the development of the internet. And so there's a technical story here too, right? How people find out about it, how people apply for it, how people use technology to apply for it. I got to believe that's something that you weren't expecting to end up writing about when you started working on this topic either.
No, and I just kept insisting that it belonged there. So I mentioned that the story or my interest in the lottery was really sparked by my experience going to internet cafes. And what fascinating spaces of the bringing the globe into people's villages, right? And there's something interesting that happens, which I think I might take Al Gore to task. I certainly take Thomas Friedman to task in the book, but there was this moment that I can remember where there was like talk about how all of this globalization of information and media and capital was really going to knit the world together. And
right.
Mixed results here. Like the way that we live our lives persists even in interconnection with each other. And there's also the way that this sort of like touted mobility is matched with all along this growing attention on people's mobility. And so we see the proliferation of border walls and more stringent migration controls and all of this growing up in tandem with this globalizing world. And that, I think, is that contradiction, right, is like happening in these internet cafes in West Africa, where people are like encountering the bounty and the promise of the United States in more immediate and personal ways than they could, back a few years earlier, where you had to wait for videotape and VCR to come to your village, and you hope
Right.
that the power's on, but now you're accessing it, at your fingertips. And so I think that makes the dissatisfaction with your current opportunities all the more potent for people at this very moment, where you're then going to the consular office and they're turning you away largely because of the color of your passport, right? So I thought that that was really important to sort of try to tease out in the story, but I also couldn't help but stumble upon this incredible moment in history, recent history, our history, which is that the first ever Usenet spam message is on the topic of the green card lottery.
Right.
And I swear my dissertation committee was like, does this belong here? We don't know. But it's fascinating. But like, how can this be part of this story? But I think it's totally part of this story because the immigration attorneys who spam Usenet, which was a precursor to like Google groups and message boards and things like that, they spam all of the Usenet groups with a message inviting people to play the green card lottery and pay them for the privilege of entering them in the lottery. Free lottery, but pay these immigration attorneys in Arizona to help you enter. And it absolutely drove the internet insane,
Right.
because it was a huge violation of norms against the commercial use of the internet. It was a huge waste of people's collective resources. And I write in the book about the way we talk to each other online, and netiquette, which is like what they called it back in those days, had been like carefully negotiated by the community itself. And then these sort of vigilante Arizona attorneys come in and just rip through the whole place, tear up all the norms, and they see cyberspace as like a frontier, and they act like American imperialists. They sort of say like, this is ours to make the best commercial use of, like your norms and rules and community standards be damned.
Well, and that even when they're asked nicely, don't do it, and they say, well, we've already done it, and no, we're not going to stop doing it, because they claim we're also providing information that people want. And this gets not only is this a story of the development of spam online, but also the role of third-party entrepreneurs in the entire visa lottery system, either in this country or even in various countries that you came across various advertisements in West Africa as well, right? People who are claiming to offer tips or secrets or some kind of magical ability to mail your application in a way that's going to guarantee that it gets accepted. And in what ways do the American authorities push back against those kinds of things? Because I'm going to relate it to that is I wrote in the margin at one point the phrase TurboTax, because just as it's possible that for most people taxes are not that complicated, and yet there's an entire industry devoted to saying this is really complicated, that's why you need to pay us. That you note that the visa lottery is actually relatively straightforward as well. And yet there are people who want to emphasize how complicated it is because that's why you have to pay somebody to do it for you. Is there any effort to try to demystify the process in order to remove these third parties, or are they sort of here to stay?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in the case of TurboTax, it's explicitly government supported, right?
Right.
So
right.
it's sustained by state forces, so they're really counting on that as like their bounty. In the case of the visa entrepreneurs, there are efforts. There's official consular efforts. They put out notices, they hold meetings, they try to sort of demystify the process. But I think the broader context of immigration restriction is so powerful, so that even if you can say like, look, you don't really need an intermediary for that, but like the whole system, its complexity is its own form of restriction. And so it's hard to believe that anyone would believe these consular these USCIS offices that closed down again. Also, I don't know if that's something that you were also sort of like getting to, which is like the
Right.
way that official policy kind of like retreats from the information spaces in these countries in this moment, that like there had been a Cold War imperative to try to like win hearts and minds, sell people on the notion of American benevolence and like, the grandeur of our culture. And that like in this post-Cold War moment, there's this kind of consensus that like we can let commercial entities sort of like do that work for us. We can let
Right.
Hollywood just do the work. And that's not to say that like there aren't state level policies that encourage it, because I do think restriction is one that does, even if this is a non-restrictive,
Hmm.
policy. But that there's this embrace of partnerships with private entities in this era that is, I'm not going to use the word neoliberalism. I would never. I don't know if I use it too many times in the book, but I think I'm ultimately describing a lot of like neoliberal
Mhm.
currents,
Right.
and noticing as I'm doing it that what Ghanaians and Nigerians applying for the lottery are encountering in their own lives, the sort of the embrace of free markets at the expense of people and their quality of life, that this is not unique to West Africa under IMF loan conditionality either, that these are global trends
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
terms of governance and capitalism that really are shaping and connecting our lives everywhere.
Right. Well, and this is one of those paradoxes that really interests me about this story, because the way that you describe when you combine sort of the history of tech and the internet and the history of West Africa, that the history of West Africa that you tell is in some ways, right, the end of certain utopian dreams, right? That when a country like Ghana gets its independence, there is an image of Africans developing a country for Africans, and that Nkrumah has a very state-centered vision for Ghana, which eventually leads him to become more oppressive than he promised he would be. But what you end up with by the 70s and the 80s is a lot of the state-run development doesn't provide what it promised it would provide. And so the state retreats and international aid organizations and international lenders come in. And so the utopia of self-development fades. Then comes this new 90s post-Cold War enthusiasm for the Washington Consensus, and I'll say it too, neoliberalism, however you want to define it. But the idea that no, the market is going to solve all of these problems. And the citizens of these countries are left sort of unclear of where they fit in here, because first they're being told, you're part of this great experiment of nation building. And now you're told, well, the nation building's not going so great, but you're part of this great experiment in globalization. And so now you can try to move if you don't want to stay here. And so use the internet, part of this globalization, to apply for a visa to go to the United States so that you can be part of these grand flows. And so the idea that, various utopias are fading, other utopias are being offered in return. And the problem with all of these utopian visions is they can't save everybody. And so people are left behind. People are left behind in development in these countries. The people are left behind because they can't all win the lottery. And has this led to any, do we see in your studies in West Africa, and you're talking about this, right? What about the kind of backlash against the bitterness that comes in communities where they say, sure, there's this lottery, but hardly anybody wins. And so therefore, is there any pushback against it? Is there hostility towards it in these, in say, African countries as a result?
It's I'm not going to speak of everybody as having one voice. There's people have very different ideas and their own, there's all kinds of different ideological movements and people with their own political views, and people who are really critical of the brain drain, people
Right.
who liken this to voluntary slavery. There's certainly commentary like that. And then there's people who see it as a boon for the individuals and the families who are able to win, who send money back, which produces immediate, physical manifestations of people's access to greater wealth. But I would say that actually what I encountered in conversations about this was a lot more bitterness about being turned down at the consulate when applying for temporary visas.
Hmm.
That people were eager to apply for visas to go abroad, to visit family, to go to conferences, to experience the world, just like anyone with a US passport, like, wants to go abroad and experience the world, but that they faced immensely high rates of visa refusals. And those visa refusals, are not, well, they're not documented, and it's not explained to people why they're being refused. But countries with high visa refusal rates can always continue to have high visa refusal rates, because you look at the visa refusal rate and you say, well, you're likely to overstay. And these are really grounded in racist ideas about who's likely to overstay and who's not. And people perceived it as being at the whims of these consular officers, because there's not documentation or standards, but the person across the desk just has immense power to say to you, no, you've paid hundreds of dollars, right? You've bought a ticket, you've applied for an expensive visa, and we're just going to say no. You've made you stand in line for days to get the appointment. You've made you travel from the north of the country down to Accra. So it can feel very humiliating. Whereas the lottery itself is very easy to enter. And even if you are not selected, it can be attributed to luck.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so the randomness of it actually, gives people more of a sense of agency, because they're not being refused on the basis of, the color of their passport,
right,
the color of their skin, but because, it wasn't their fate to win. And luck has a lot of power. And I mean, like, look, we just had like a gambler as a president. Like, it's there's so much to be said about like gambling and lotteries and casinos, and that as sort of like a metaphor for our whole economic system. But that who wins is random.
And so because it's random, people are willing to say, oh, well, better luck next time.
Better luck next time, especially, if it's able to continue. And also to sort of acknowledge that like life's winners and losers, we don't have a lot of say. The air was poisoned the other day here in Philadelphia, and nobody seems to have anything to say other than like, you better hope the wind blows a different way next time, right? Like, luck has this ascendant role in a world where we have sort of abandoned our capacities for collective change.
Wow.
But I would love to say something more optimistic too.
That's all right. Well, we do not shy away from the hard truths here at People, Politics, and Prose, or at FPRI. But we have just a couple minutes left, and I'm thinking about this issue of, what does a good policy look like, or a better policy look like? Going back to Fritz Heinzen's question about, what could be done that would be different or better when we think more broadly about immigration policy. But I'll also phrase that in the sense of, what's the future of the diversity lottery? And is there a place for the diversity lottery if there is any reform that would actually have, whatever immigration reform means? We could talk about that too. But is there a place for the diversity lottery in a better system, or is the diversity lottery just something that is good to have in a system that is otherwise deeply problematic?
Yeah, well, the lucky thing for me as a historian, we're very bad at predicting the future. We're not really supposed to do that. That's not our job, and
Truth.
we really shouldn't. But it does not look likely that Congress is going to amend the INA in any significant way anytime soon. We've seen the collapse of any kind of comprehensive immigration reform for the last 20 years. And if anything, the questions and the core assumptions that people bring with them have become thornier and more entrenched and like less likely to be negotiated into any kind of like productive direction. But I think the lottery teaches us something really important, which is that any kind of system needs to let people in. You know, I don't love the phrase the immigration system is broken, because I think a lot of what the immigration system does, it's doing because it's supposed to do that. And the immigration system is harmful, right? The immigration system is violent. I don't know if there's a humane way to block the human right to migrate. If, I'm thinking of my relatives fleeing Eastern Europe. I don't think they saw a future for themselves. Had they stayed any longer, their future would have been very bleak, right? And there's so many of us with stories like that. And to tell, a mother of children, like, no, you have to stay because this is the law. Well, there's nowhere to stay, right? So if people want to live their lives and enact their dreams, migration has always been a very important way to do that. And a lot of what we find troubling and harmful and problematic about our immigration system is the way that restriction has continued to just be at its core. That at its core, it's about keeping people out, not letting people in, even when it's letting certain people in.
Right. Well, and so we're back to that idea that a system that is harsh in so many ways, but offers this one glimmer of hope in the luck of the draw. And of course, my one of my favorite tunes that I think of by Sinatra, right, is "Luck Be a Lady," and if that lady is Lady Liberty, and the images and all those Statue of Liberty posters at the immigrant visa places across Africa that you document in your book. Yeah, I don't know what the future brings either, but yes, I have mine too. So everybody, the book in question is Dreamland, America's Immigration Lottery in an Age of Restriction. The author is Carly Goodman. The publisher is the University of North Carolina Press. We've been delighted to have you with us here, Carly, to talk to us, and we encourage listeners and viewers to track down a copy of the book so they can engage with this complicated, fascinating history that you tell. But for today, thanks so much, Carly Goodman, for being with us on People, Politics, and Prose.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a delight to have a conversation with Ron Granieri.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for viewing and listening in. FPRI thanks our sponsors and partners for their generous support. We encourage you to consider becoming a generous sponsor or partner of FPRI, because even though today's conversation is over, today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will always be here to talk about it at FPRI. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, we encourage you to tell a friend and bring a friend next time when we gather to discuss our complicated world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. But until next time, with thanks to all the people at FPRI that make this possible, and for all of us, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.